It's Friday, so it's time for our agile, not so agile episode of the Daily Stand Up Podcast. And I wanted this one to be a little bit personal. So here we go. I recently had the opportunity to do something pretty amazing, and I wanted to share some of the thoughts and some of the things that I learned. So we had the opportunity to rent a truck in Davenport, Florida, and load said truck. It was a 16-foot box truck, and we loaded the truck. And we had the opportunity, or should I say I had the opportunity to drive from Davenport, Florida, all the way to Harriman, Utah, to drop off some things from one house to the other. Now, that may seem interesting to many because many would say, well, are you moving? And perhaps, but not necessarily everything. It was one of those things where one of my sons recently got married. My oldest daughter decided she wanted to buy her own place. And my oldest son is going to be living here in Utah. So it really made it an opportunity for me to get a lot of our belongings transported back that we wanted here in Utah. But it wasn't necessarily a, hey, we're giving up hope and selling a house and moving back kind of thing. But I wanted to give some insight about what was set to happen. So I started out by searching and researching and trying to find a perfect vehicle to make this cross country trek in. And I found a company, one of the rental truck companies, that rented me a truck. And I went to pick up the truck. And I remember the individual when I went to pick up the truck. He was very, how shall I say, reserved or quiet. He didn't have a lot to say. He was a man of few words, but he had someone else in the office who was cracking jokes and having a good time and just enjoying life. And he was a retired Air Force veteran. And I remember when he said to me, "Oh, I cleaned up your truck." He says, "I had a feeling you were going to be someone from the military coming to pick up this truck." He says, "So I made it really nice." He goes, "Let's go take a look at it." And we went outside and he pulls out the sheet of paper. And he started walking around the truck with me. He's like, "Yeah," he goes, "it's got scratches up here. It's got a small dent here. It's got some wheel rub here. It's got, all this tar that splashed up on it. It has two cracks in the windshield. It's got this. It's got that." And as he made his way around the truck, this guy, he inspected that truck top to bottom, left to right, and wrote down every single piece of damage the truck had. Because he turned to me and he says, "The last thing I want is for you to be accountable for something that was already there." So the first lesson that I learned was a lesson of accountability. And it was really, really neat to see this guy who I'd never met before, who cared enough to make sure that I wouldn't be held accountable for things that I didn't do. And I couldn't think of a better way to start off the trip, right? Now, when I did check the mileage, he says, check the gas tank, check and make sure you've got full tank. I said, yeah, I got a full tank. So then I didn't discover until the first time that I filled it up that I actually did not have a full tank. I was about, I don't know, 50 miles shy of a full tank, but still, it wasn't a big deal. With the level of service that I received when I picked up the truck, I was very, very happy. Now, I picked up the truck on Friday the 13th, go figure. And I went back to my home and we loaded the truck. And we loaded the truck. I got home probably about 12:30, 1 p.m. And we loaded the truck until 10:30 at night, pretty much, close to 11. And I got my rest and I woke up bright and early on Saturday morning and decided to start my drive. Now, for those of you who've never made this trek before, it is approximately 2,349 miles and should take 34 hours of travel time to be able to navigate this. So 34 hours of time, 2,349 miles. And of course, that's not counting sleeping or construction zones or all the other good stuff. Dodging bullets in Kentucky. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, there was just so many things that had to be done. So I left in the morning and I remember the drive. And when I left from Florida, one of the things that I noted was that I expected Florida. I was so excited to get out of Florida, quote unquote, that I thought, oh man, I'll just be able to cruise through Florida in no time and I'll be in Georgia and well on my way. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. Florida took a lot longer than I thought it would. It was one of those discovery moments where there was a lot more in a north-south trek of Florida than I anticipated. And it wasn't necessarily a negative thing. It was just not what I was expecting or not what I was ready for. I said, okay. I said, this is one of those opportunities where you live and you learn. But I can tell you, the one thing I was trying to be really mindful of is what time I left Florida so that I would not hit rush hour traffic in Atlanta. because I knew that I'd have to be driving through Georgia exactly after I drove through Florida. So my plan was, if I was going to hit rush hour traffic, that was going to be my first place that I was going to stop, and stay the night or whatever the case may be. But I also thought, Atlanta's not always the safest place for someone in a moving truck full of goods driving by themselves to stay at a hotel overnight. So I said, maybe it'd be better if I drove through Atlanta. So I continued my trek through Georgia, through Atlanta. And before you know it, I was out of Atlanta and I was moving on into Kentucky, or Tennessee first. So I was in Tennessee. Now, Tennessee, I got to tell you, even though I spent probably the shortest amount of time in Tennessee, it was absolutely gorgeous. It was one of my favorite places. We passed through a couple of the major cities there. I got to pass right by Nashville, and it was absolutely stunning. It was just beautiful. And I thought to myself, I'm just going to stop here in Tennessee and things will be good. Before you knew it, I blinked my eyes and I was already in Kentucky. Now, that sounds like, wow, that's a long way. But what I can tell you is when I was in Kentucky, I thought the thought didn't even cross my mind, but I saw some obscure road signs I'd never seen before, about absolutely no picking up hitchhikers, please continue driving, no stopping unless absolutely necessary. I'm like, what is all this about? And the thought never even crossed my mind that I was driving through the exact area where there was a recent shooter who was shooting people from overpass in the highway. And I literally drove on the interstate at the exact spot where that happened. So I drove straight through where that happened. And it was just surreal because I didn't think about it until after I had stopped, way later. But I literally drove through the exact section of Kentucky where that happened. So by this point, I had traversed Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and I was in Kentucky. And what I could tell you is it was starting to get late. I was starting to get tired, and I knew that the next city or the next state was Missouri. So I was like, I don't want to get to Missouri and major cities. I'll be exhausted. So I said, it's Saturday night. I'm going to sleep in Kentucky. So I did my thing and slept in Kentucky on Saturday night. So I tracked how long I drove. I drove for about 12 hours. So I thought to myself, man, that's a long time driving, right? I mean, but I'm one of those early to rise people. And my desire to not stop in Atlanta, but enjoying the beautiful scenery of Tennessee and Kentucky just really took me where I needed to be. So I slept the night in Kentucky. Woke up bright and early and decided, all right, I'm gonna get out of here. I got to get through Missouri, and then I knew there was Illinois after that. So I hopped in my truck, did my drive, and all along the way I was filling up, and things were good. The truck was performing exactly like it should. None of my stuff was shifting around in the back. All the drivers were courteous, with the exception of Georgia. To this point, I was like, this has been a good ride, and I made it up into Missouri. And I made it through St. Louis, and it was absolutely gorgeous. I got to see the arch, and that was absolutely amazing. And I kept on driving on my way towards Kansas City. I said, I'm going to stop and grab a bite to eat. So Saturday afternoon, I stopped to grab a bite to eat. And I asked the person where I was eating, I said, hey, I'm sorry, Sunday. It was Sunday because I stayed the night Saturday in Kentucky. So Sunday afternoon, I stopped and grabbed a bite to eat. And I asked the server, I said, hey, do you know if the Chiefs play in town today? And she says, yeah, they do. So I had it timed almost perfectly that I was going to be driving through Kansas City at the Kansas border, where the Chiefs Stadium is at Arrowhead, right about the time before games started. And I'm like, oh, this is going to suck. This is going to be bad. So I said, you know what? I'm going to try to get out of here a little bit early to make sure that happens. So I got out early and I hustled in the truck trying to make it past the game day Kansas City Chiefs madness, to get to my destination or to get through that. And as luck would have it, I was driving by an executive airport, and a couple of police cars and SUVs pulled onto the interstate, and a car just zoomed by, and you could see the person through the car because the windows were not tinted, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I promise you, it was none other than the legend herself, Taylor Swift, on her way to the stadium. So I had my next run-in with Taylor Swift. So that was kind of cool. But she was on her way to the Chiefs game to watch her boyfriend play ball. And I just tailed that group and made it through behind them. They were clearing traffic as they went through. It was pretty awesome. So instead of it turning into a really negative situation, this turned into a really positive situation. So the next thing I learned about my trip was that good things come when you do a little bit of upfront planning, but don't fret if your plan doesn't go as promised, because if you're a spiritual person and believe in a higher power, someone will look out for you and everything will be okay. But the other part that I didn't cover was where I stopped in Kentucky for the night and why. So let's back up for a moment. So I was in Kentucky and I had to choose where I wanted to stay. And I chose one city and I got off and I felt good about it. And they said they had a hotel with truck parking. So I went and I parked my truck and I was getting out to go check in the hotel. And it was storming down rain. And there was someone sitting outside in the rain. And they're like, "Hey, how's it going? Can you spare a few dollars? Nice truck, man." And I'm just like, oh boy. It was pretty much guaranteed that if I stayed at this location, my truck was either going to be broken into or stolen. And I'm like, I thought I was in a good area. So I hopped back in a truck and drove an additional 85 miles to Paducah, Kentucky, where I felt a lot more safe. And I hopped off at an exit there. And I said, "Oh, it's the same hotel, so they should have the truck parking." And when I pulled off and I went to the hotel, I got to the hotel and it had signs everywhere that said "no trucks," and I'm like, okay, well, I'm in a box truck. What am I going to do? So I went and parked in the next parking lot because it was relatively safe. And I walked over to the hotel to check in, and I said, "Do you have a vehicle you're parking with us?" And I said, "Yes." I parked my truck, and the second I said truck, they're like, "No truckers allowed. You can't stay here." And I was like, "Whoa, holy cow!" So I literally had to drive another 15 miles to the next stop, and it was getting late at this point. And I finally made it to the last destination, and I ended up staying the night at a hotel that was less desirable. Um, it was sketchy. We'll leave it at that. But it did have a truck parking lot. It did have a place to back in, and it had a pole that I backed up against, so I didn't have to worry about people trying to take stuff out of the back of the truck. She couldn't lower the ramp. It was very inconvenient. It made it inconvenient for anyone to try to break in. But I do remember when I checked in, the guy's like, "Okay, your room's gonna be on the third floor." Blah blah blah. I said, "Okay, which way's the elevators?" He goes, "The stairs are right there." So I had to huck everything that I had in the front of the truck with me up through to the third floor to stay at this hotel when I know there were openings on other floors. It was just one of those things where it was a test of my patience at the end of the day. So what I quickly learned was I needed to trust my instinct. And I think that was the next lesson I wanted to share. That if we trust our instinct, we can get to where we need to be. And then finally, I told you the story about making it through. So left Kentucky, made it through St. Louis, made it to Kansas City, started navigating through Illinois, up near Iowa, crossed over Iowa into Nebraska. Now, this is probably the most painful part of the entire drive. It's the state of Nebraska. I don't care what you say. Nebraska is the home of more cornfields than anything I've ever seen in my life. I drove for hours past cornfields thinking it would never end. I mean, it got to the point where I had to stay somewhere in Nebraska. I just couldn't stand seeing another piece of corn. And I think it was pretty close to Colorado where I decided to stay, or near the Colorado border, I should say. But I wasn't crossing into Colorado. I was still crossing through Nebraska into Wyoming. So I stayed my second night in Nebraska. Now, what I realized then was I drove another 12 hours and I chalked up a lot more miles. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm making pretty decent time. So Saturday morning I left. Saturday night I stayed in Kentucky. Sunday morning I left. Sunday night I stayed in Nebraska. I woke up Monday morning completely recharged and said, "All right, I'm going to do this." Hopped in a truck and started driving. Made it into Wyoming. Started coming down through the hills into Utah. And before you know it, at 5:30 p.m., I made it into Utah. So I literally left Saturday morning from Florida and made it Monday afternoon into Utah. Now, it wasn't until I looked at my paperwork that I realized that I had the truck reserved for 9 days because that is the standard number of hours driven with 1 day or 1.5 days of loading on each side. It's supposed to take you 5 to 6 days to get across the country. The part that I did in 2.5. I did sleep as soon as I got home, shortly thereafter because I was sore from driving. But I eventually, got here safe and sound, got the truck parked, unloaded it on Tuesday, and was going to return it on Tuesday afternoon. But I missed the cutoff by like 20 minutes to the place closed. So I had to return the truck yesterday morning. And what I can tell you was I had one dear friend who came out of his way to help me unload the truck. And what I can tell you is I've never been so grateful I have good friends. My third lesson was, even though you don't want to burden people, accepting help from others is something that's so powerful. And I felt so blessed to have a wonderful, amazing friend, someone who I would do anything for, to give up time from his family and from his job to come and help me unload a truck, full of stuff that he'll never have the chance to enjoy. Let's just put it that way, right? It spoke volumes to me. And I think the other part of the lesson that was interesting is even the people that live in my neighborhood who drove by and waved while I was unloading a truck, nobody bothered to stop and say, "Hey, do you need a hand unloading that?" Seeing that I was doing it all by myself for the majority of the day. So the last lesson that I learned was that sometimes when you live in a community and you think you're surrounded by people who are willing to extend a helping hand and do the things they need to do, that's hard for them to break away from their busy lives to do so. But you discover who your real friends are when you got a moving truck that needs to be unloaded. So we unloaded the moving truck, and after many, many doses of Aleve, I finally felt strong enough to move around and do some things. And what I can tell you is across this whole journey, the takeaways that I learned is that, one, truckers look out for each other. I can't tell you how many times I had people in 18 wheelers and other people in box trucks who looked out for me and I looked out for them. Two, that for someone who doesn't drive tons of long distance drives, this was thoroughly enjoyable for me. And it was a great drive and a great vehicle, and I made it in record time. And then three, when you believe in a higher power and you're blessed to have all these things that could have gone wrong not go wrong, and to know that you're being looked out for. One of the things I remember is every time I looked at the GPS or every time I looked at the mileage, there was always a significant number, whether it was 777 or 1111. Or one time I said, "Can it just please stop raining? I can't see." And the sun started beaming through my window as the clouds parted. And I looked at the time and it was 1:43. And I said, "Yeah, I love you too." It was just one of those things where I couldn't have asked for a better experience. And I realized that this episode did go over my 15-minute threshold, but there are so many key takeaways here. My hope is that if you have a dream or if you have a journey that you need to take in your life, that you'll take inventory of, do you have 34 hours to spare? Are you up for a 2,349-mile trek? Do you have friends that will support you and help you to make it successfully to your destination? Do you understand what it takes to do hard things? And are you willing to make sacrifice and do the things that are hard in order to have a just reward at the end? And are you mindful of all the things that happen around you? Do you look in your mirrors as often as possible to see the things that have passed as well as seeing the things in front of you, so that you can really do the things that are necessary to have the best impact? And I think that if we live our life in such a way that we look for blessings and opportunities, and we look for opportunities to help others, it's going to make the world a lot better place for us. So whether it's a cross-country trek, or it's time with your family, or it's understanding the things that are placed in front of you, I challenge you to look at life differently, see things through a different lens, and be the better person. That's going to do it. Until next Monday, do take care. Bye now.